Hello, podcast listeners. I am so excited to have Kiki Yablon of Kiki Yablon Dog Training on the podcast today. And we're going to be talking about my nervous system's least favorite topic, which is barking. So welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, excited to have you. So many pet parents reach out to trainers and behavior consultants in hopes to reduce or even eliminate, which is pretty impossible, their dog's barking behavior. And we get it. Like, barking can be startling. It can be frustrating. And in our culture, it's really not a socially acceptable behavior, in air quotes, even though, as I just sort of alluded to, they are dogs, right? So
Right.
I thought Kiki would be a great person to bring on to the show to talk about this particular behavior and the behavior modification process around it. So before we dive into that, Kiki, I know that you share your life, same as me, with a senior dog, Pigeon.
Yes.
Which is like the cutest name ever. And I don't know if I told you, but I've been in animal welfare for so many years, and we name animals that come in, right? And I don't think I've met a pigeon. And so I just love that name, like, so creative. And so can you share with our listeners your favorite thing about her?
She's the dog who's the reason that I became a trainer. I think I have a similar origin story to many other trainers where you adopt a dog and it's not the experience that you expect. And so you begin down a path of sort of trying to fix them. And then that turns into a path of trying to help them. And then what I really appreciate with her is that it eventually turned into a path of sort of just learning to have a nice life together and not modify her behavior. So I feel like I've been through many of the issues that my clients face, barking and lunging at, you name it. I thought I was going to have a dog that I would just take everywhere with me. I would, could come to the barbecue and go to work with me and hang out. And she was really none of those things. But I feel like she is the dog who taught me to appreciate dogs for who they are, rather than who we want them to be. She's also super cute.
She's really cute.
She'll be 17 in February. So
no way. I didn't realize she was that old. And she's how much, like, what does she weigh? Cause she's not like we're not talking a small 12-pound dog here.
She's about 30 pounds.
She's 30. Okay. I guess she's a little bit bigger in her photos,
so
but yeah.
Fortunately, 17. She's not too big for us to carry her up and down the stairs, which we kind of have to do sometimes. So
yes, that is a problem with my 90-pound dog as he ages. There's many times where I'm like, why did I buy this home with a bunch of steps in it? And yes, so we are working on getting him used to like a sling support system. He doesn't need it right now, but yeah, that is life with a senior dog.
Good time to do it.
Exactly.
We've been using a rough wear, one of the rough wear harnesses for her that has the extra strap and a handle.
Yeah.
It's not quite a help me up harness, but it is like, she can kind of like, if we just kind of put our hand through that, she can sort of walk up the stairs a bit more confidently. And we use it to help lift her in and out of the car. And then also to like, I think her hiking days may be coming to an end, but we have been hiking a lot with her for the past 2 years. How long is this pandemic? Like more than normal. I'm ashamed to say that we didn't hike that much before, as much as we do now. But she likes to, I'm totally anthropomorphizing, but I think she likes it when we let her try to jump over like a log and then just sort of help like catch her on her jumping.
Yeah.
She seems to prefer that to being lifted over which I think is really interesting. So
yeah, I actually noticed that as well, where like Sully would prefer, like, I'm just there as like a spot right now, but if I sort of stand there and hover and like add some physical pressure or spatial pressure, right? Like he's like, he sort of stalls a little bit and waits until I remove myself, and then he winds up walking up the steps. I'm like, okay. So yeah, I definitely like that assist is probably easier for them versus that actually helping them do the thing. So
yeah, that's interesting. It's interesting to hear that you have that experience too. She really doesn't like if we stand by the log and she's like goes and sniffs.
Yeah, it's like, what are you doing? Yeah.
It just lets me know that I'm obviously still really clumsy about helping her. So gotta work on my skills.
Exactly. So we know that all behavior has a function, right? Or else it wouldn't continue. And so when we're thinking about barking happens for a variety of reasons, right? And so what would you say are some common functions of barking behavior?
So it depends. I think it depends on how you talk about functions. Like, if we could talk about, like, there are infinite functions for barking in terms of purposes. I think it's sort of like asking, what is the function of talking? It can be very specific. Like, I'm talking to you for this reason because I need this specific thing in this specific circumstance. But we could also probably categorize some of those functions to things like, getting basic needs met or making things go away, or, so I find it most useful to look at the specific functions most of the time. Like specifically, when a dog walks by the front window and the dog barks and the dog outside goes away, or the mailman, classic mail carrier example, so sometimes we look at function. I think a lot of times we tend to look at the function of barking by what the barking looks like, as opposed to what the barking seems to make happen in the environment. So that can be, I think a lot of times that can be a distinction that's being missed. So, and that, not to get ahead of us, but that looking at function in terms of outcome is part of, I think, what makes the protocol that we are going to talk about work. So, yeah. So I think in big general strokes, barking to get things that you need from your owner, like attention, food is usually a big one. Interactions like play, getting access to the outdoors. I mean, pretty much dogs, sometimes this keeps me up at night, but like basically dogs have to ask for their entire lives just to be able to go to the bathroom. Yeah. So, and when dogs don't have very many other skills in their repertoire, then barking is one of the ones that tends to come pretty naturally. And then the other big category is probably to avoid things that you don't want, or escape things that you don't want to interact with, right? So getting things you want, getting away, or making things go away that you don't want.
Yeah. I appreciate that you bring up the point that, like, if they don't have a variety of other skills that help them get access to something or avoid something, that they're going to choose a behavior that is really normal to them. And barking usually gets our attention, right? I mean, it's loud, it's verbal, it's vocal, right? So it does get our attention, and eventually we wind up inadvertently reinforcing this behavior, and so does the external environment. So I appreciate you bringing up that point for our pet parent listeners, right? That are like, oh, like, why is my dog barking so much? It's like, well, Like it's a behavior that is working, and we might need to replace that behavior with additional skills so that they're not relying on just that sole behavior, which is again, super normal for them.
Right. So we're like, why is my dog barking at me to get food instead of sitting? And it's like, well, sitting is not a behavior that is sort of like, why is my dog barking at me instead of sitting nicely? Well, sitting, if dogs are, living at the trash dump, sitting is not a behavior they would normally use to get food, right? That's a behavior that starts out for one reason, like my legs are tired or whatever, and then it acquires new purposes, right? As you go through life. I always sort of think of like why do babies cry to get everything that they need? Because they don't have any other skills yet. Right. And that's one that comes standard with the package of human baby or whatever. And
part of the programming.
Right. And the first time they do it, I think there's a misunderstanding out there that if you are talking about operant behavior, that you're saying that this behavior never happens. I just read something like this somewhere. I can't remember where it was, but like basically that the idea that the behavior wouldn't happen, that the idea that behavior is driven by consequences gets mixed up with some kind of idea that means we think that if you haven't had any experience, you would never do that behavior. And that's not really accurate. It's, there are genetic, pigs root, people use, talk, dogs bark, there's a package that kind of comes genetically with your species, and probably also with your particular genetic, inheritance. But then once those behaviors hit the environment will modify almost all of them.
Yes.
To some degree. Right.
Yeah.
Even I don't want to spoil LLA for anybody that hasn't taken it yet, Susan Friedman's course, but I always think about that. Like one of the discussion points is what behaviors can be influenced by consequences. This is in sort of the homework portion of the course. And I always think about like even reflexes, even behaviors that we think of as reflexive, like sneezing, right? I think everyone would immediately say sneezing is a reflex, like you don't control that, right? Something goes up your nose and you sneeze. But if you break it down a little bit, like something goes up your nose and you're in a movie theater. Right? Instead of going like, at you, bleh, like all over the place, you are like, so your behavior, a lot of the behavior that we would call a sneeze, generally speaking, is actually operant. So like there's some tiny piece of it, and I'm not an expert in physiology, so I don't know exactly what piece it is that you're gonna do no matter what, regardless of consequences. Right? You can't punish sneezing out of a person completely that you would want to. But you can punish certain parts of sneezing, like, and so obviously certain parts of sneezing are probably learned. Like it feels really good to do the full gross, giant,
full gross
like,
sneeze,
spray everywhere sneeze. I think that probably feels good, right? So you might do it when you're alone, but if you're, in this day and age, if you're around other people, or you're wearing a mask and you don't want like gross stuff all over your face or whatever, so barking comes with the package, but I would not go so far as to say that it's like, the tendency to bark is innate, but like beyond that, lots of things about barking are probably learned from experience, like starting the very first time that the dog opens its mouth and makes a sound.
So if there is a pet parent that, part of the reason why it's important for a pet parent to figure out the function of the dog's barking is because that is going to be really, really good information for us to create a behavior modification plan, right? So how would you suggest, or when you're working with pet parents, what are some of the questions that you're asking them about the behavior to help them understand like the purpose, right, of the barking?
So some of the things that I would look at are the questions I would ask are, when does it happen? Because I think it's pretty common to get a complaint that, my dog is barking all the time or barking nonstop. And if we look at it closely, it's not really all the time. There's certain circumstances. So I usually actually look for sort of the antecedent circumstances first. And the reason for that is just mostly because that doesn't necessarily tell us the function of the barking, but it might give us a hint. The dog is barking when someone leans over them. My guess is probably that when we ask about what happens then after the dog barks is that the person backs away. But also because a lot of the easiest solutions for pet parents, especially those who maybe are really busy and not super invested in training every single thing, might be to just remove that antecedent. So this common advice among dog trainers in our circle, put window film up. If the dog barks when people go by the window and barks when they see them versus hear them, we can just eliminate that pretty much immediately by changing that condition. And then in terms of deciding what the purpose is, like I was saying before, there sometimes tends to be, we tend to say, oh, if the dog is barking at the mailman, it's because the mailman goes away. And I do think that is often the case. But we tend to intervene on barking really fast. And sometimes I think we add other functions to barking that didn't exist before. Even when it starts out for one reason, right? I'm barking to make the mailman go away. And then the owner immediately calls the dog and takes them into the backyard, or gives them something to chew, or, talks to them and pets them and says, it's okay, it's just the mailman. Those are other things that we might look at to see if those are actually why the dog is barking out the window now. So that's sort of the difference between looking at like, well, he's barking at the mailman, he must want the mailman to go away. And then looking at, well, what actually happens? And to go back to sit, this is something that happens with behavior all the time, is it starts for one reason and we give it another reason. Right. So I think I'm probably going to butcher this, but Emily Johnson-Vey had a funny anecdote that I always think of, where she talks about if your kid comes to you and says, God, I hope I don't screw this up too badly. Your kid comes to you and says, I would like a glass of milk, and you give them a soccer ball. Like the first time they're going to be like, what? I didn't ask for this. But then maybe they play with the soccer ball and it's fun. And then they want the soccer ball again. And they come to you and they say, can I have a glass of milk? And you give them a soccer ball. Right. So pretty soon you have like a weird behavior of coming and asking for a soccer ball by saying, may I have some milk? Right. So, we teach tons of behaviors for that weren't originally to get food. We make them behaviors to get food, like sit. And I think we can do that with barking too, both inadvertently or even on purpose. We teach dogs to speak to get food, right? Bark once on purpose to get food. So why wouldn't we be able to teach dogs to go bark when the mailman appears to get food? I have a feeling there are probably some behaviors where it's harder to kind of add functions to, but I don't know for sure.
And to go back to what you're saying, sort of like the age old question about like, am I reinforcing the barking? So I'm imagining when you were saying dog is approaching the window, barking, whoever was walking past the house leaves.
Right.
But during that time, in some capacity, the owner then says, Spot, go to Matt. And then now they're laying down and getting food there. You're curious about whether or not some of that barking originally started off with, hey, I want space between me and this home invader, right? Oh, and now I'm actually going to get food when I'm laying down on the mat, right? So there could be two purposes of the original barking. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, the barking may have produced two outcomes. One is
okay,
that the person goes away because they were going to go away anyway. And then the other is that you are given the opportunity to earn food by doing a certain behavior. I think frequently what we see is that person tries to get the dog to do something else and the dog can't do it because they're too concerned about the person going away. But I do think that there are sometimes sometimes we do see the other thing. And so one thing that I've started, like I had a client recently actually a couple who were moving to a new house, and in their old house, the dog barked out the window at stuff or barked at stuff from the yard. And my advice now tends to be, just give it a week and don't do anything and see what happens. Right. Because I think, you bring a new dog into your home and they've never lived there before. Right. They've maybe never been in a house before, and like stuff goes by the window and they bark at it and it goes away. I think a couple things can happen if you just give it some time. So one is you probably don't want this one, the dog learns, oh, hey, I bark at that thing and it goes away. But the other thing I think can happen is basically habituation, which is like if you move into a house next to train tracks, right? In the first week, every time the train goes by, it's going to wake you up. You're going to, you might be upset about it or whatever, but after a while, you don't really hear it. Or like living under a flight path, right? So some people get sensitized to it and get more and more upset about the airplanes flying over. But most people probably just, like, if you ask them how many times does an airplane fly over your house, they're like, I don't know, I don't really hear it anymore. Now if like an airplane falls out of the sky onto your house, that is probably going to sensitize you to it. Likewise, if every time an airplane flies over your house, like $5 gets deposited into your bank account, then you also are probably going to notice the airplane flying over. So I want the more recent of those clients, she basically just sort of introduced them to the yard without a lot of intervention. And she's been kind of amazed, like the dogs are learning, or just sort of like, we're like, oh, let's just relax here.
Yeah. It reminds me a lot of what Sarah Strumming talks about when if you're walking down the street with your dog or a trail and you wind up like stepping off the trail because there's a person and a dog and you're feeding, you make the presence of that stimulus have more value or have more meaning. And so the dog starts to orient to that even more so, right? And a lot of times we're doing that to create a positive association. I'm going to step off the trail and there's a person and a dog and I'm feeding you and it's so great and yay. And we get some operant behavior there. Lovely. Let's reinforce that as well. But it brings more value. And what you're saying is like, if you can be a little hands off, it's just like, there's a thing we don't care. There's a thing we don't care.
Maybe you curve around it at first, so it's not so salient that the dog is magnetized to that person. Yeah, I feel like with reactivity, a lot of like the first thing I've always done, because that's what I was taught, is management, right? Like give more space, Don't stop it. Don't, let your dog sniff, basically, because sniffing is often a way for dogs to kind of go, woo, doo, 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 there's something over there that I don't want to interact with or whatever. And for a lot of sort of mild to moderate cases, just implementing that, what I started to notice is that the dog, if you just give a little more space, the dog just sniffs when people go by. Without you adding
like tons of interventions, right?
On the flip side, my dog, when we pass a person on the trail, stops walking and looks at me. And the stopping walking is kind of annoying, but I trained that because I did that. I pulled off to the side and stopped walking. And I still might do that with clients, because
just depends.
For a lot of reasons. Like, I think it's easier for people to do training if they're not also trying to walk at the same time.
That is a skill.
But I am more thoughtful about it. And that is actually a point that Sarah has, that relates to a point that I've seen Sarah make in a number of ways that I really feel strongly about too, which is, even if you think you're doing counter conditioning, non-contingent, the food is contingent. There is actually contingency. The food is contingent on the presence of the
I was gonna say
trigger, right? Pay attention to what operant behavior you are setting the dog up to do, and what operant behavior you are reinforcing. And Lindsay Wood has some great stuff on that she's presented on at Clicker Expo every year for the past few years, about sort of building that into your counter conditioning procedures and capitalizing on those operant behaviors, because they're happening at the same time.
Yes, they are happening at the same time. What are some of your favorite management strategies? Because like you said, like not everybody's like, oh, I can't wait to implement a whole barking behavior modification protocol, right? Like some clients, they just want that management strategy and that makes sense to them and they're happy to live in that way. So what are some additional ones outside of like placing film up on a window or a door or something like that to block the visual stimulation? What are some of your other favorite management strategies?
Well, I have had clients who've had success with white noise machines for dogs who bark at sounds, sort of placing the white noise machine next to the front door or the place where the sound comes out of. I never have tried it myself, I'll be honest, because I feel like a white noise machine would annoy me more than the barking. But I have a high tolerance for barking. So also, like, sort of naturally occurring white noise stuff, like if a lot of people here have window unit air conditioners because Chicago old apartment buildings didn't come with central air, or a box fan, something that you might be more used to hearing, at least in the summer. Closing windows, closing doors, using baby gates to make, like, if the front room is where the dog hangs out and barks at the window all day, then we don't maybe we hang out in the back of the house when nobody's there to train. And then if we broaden out our sort of interventions a little, like let's call management, let's broaden that out to like antecedent interventions, which means things that you do before the behavior happens to make it less likely, sort of hitting the basic needs, that the dog may be, there might be things that you can do that would make it sort of less reinforcing for the dog to make things go away all day. So that could range anywhere from, working on what they do when they see those things when they're outside with you, to making sure they have other things that maybe they'd rather be doing. Making sure they're getting enough sleep. I get more startled if I haven't gotten enough sleep. Sort of on out to what you would call like motivating operations, or things that affect the value of the reinforcer. So those I think would be very individualized.
Yeah. In addition to like I love that you brought up having other things within their space. So maybe having other opportunities for enrichment or even physical activity, right? Like I know what we are dog sitting my stepdaughter's dog right now, and she's a younger dog, and having had a repertoire with a senior dog, right? That Sully really doesn't require
Just
a lot,
sleeps.
right? He sleeps a lot. I mean, I get him up, moving around. We do training and play a lot, but she's definitely a little bit more on the anxious side. And if she doesn't have the appropriate amount of physical enrichment, like she's going to be like alerting to that things are walking by her house in the front of the house. So yeah, making sure that like your dog's needs are met in general, right? Is part of that antecedent arrangement as well, which is great.
Yeah. I think things are hard right now too, because people are home, even with the sort of all people going back to work, there's a lot of people who are still home a lot more often than they were. And I think so there's a lot more opportunity for their dogs to ask them for stuff.
Yeah.
So, which maybe is good for the dogs, but
yes, but let's actually
some friction.
Yeah, let's talk about that actually, because I think I see this often, right? Where clients inadvertently reinforce the barking, right? I mean, and we all inadvertently reinforce behaviors, right? And I always share with my clients, like, listen, hey, I have been guilty of this too. There's just no way, right, that we can't. And so a lot of times what I'll do with my clients where we have a dog that's asking for something, or what did I hear it called? Like request seeking, or like it instead of like demand barking, right? It was like request seeking, or like, which is just such a lovely reframe, right? Because the dog clearly has a need and they're making a request, right? Something that we as a human culture could learn how to do better, right? And so I think what I'm doing with my clients in that situation, and I'd love to hear what you're doing, is we're identifying, like you said earlier, when does this happen throughout the day? What are the conditions in which it happens? Is there a way that we can proactively meet the dog's needs just in like generally throughout the day? And is there a way that we can proactively meet that dog's needs in that moment? So for example, if they come to you every time you log on to Zoom, right? Or you're like sitting at the computer and now you're ignoring them, could we proactively give them something to do away from you, whether that's a licky mat or, do the walk prior to Zoom, right? So that their needs are met, so that they're not making a request at a time it doesn't work for you. So I'm just curious if that's what you're doing as well with your clients.
Yeah. So actually that issue that you just described is the subject of my thesis research. That's what
great.
That's what I'm working on. And I think in a majority of cases, that kind of thing is gonna be helpful, right? Like you set like, I got to be on Zoom for an hour. Here is something for you to do for an hour. I make sure that we've had our walk before this. The interesting thing about the Zoom situation and certain other situations that I've seen with clients too, like very often with guests in the house. Like I think I can think of just off the top of my head, like three clients where the presence of guests was the cue for the dog to bark at the owners. And what I think often happens is, so let's say you're on Zoom for an hour and you've given the dog a puzzle toy, and the puzzle toy runs out at 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Right. And the dog goes, hey,
yeah,
hey, this puzzle toy is empty.
Yeah.
And the person is like, oh my God,
yeah,
I'm on a business meeting, feed. Right. I mean, I even encountered this, like going to Zoom during the pandemic. Like my first challenge was actually to get my dog to come in this room at all, because I never did anything with her in this room before. And that was partially intentional because I started graduate school and I needed a place to like study where I wasn't going to be interrupted. And I went in this room, which had previously been like just like a storehouse for the ugliest furniture we own. And I made it nice. And I like would come in here to study, and she would come in and be like, "What are you doing in here?" And I'd be like, tippity tap, tap, tap. And she'd be like, "All right, I'm leaving."
Yeah.
Right. And I think like that was a great opportunity. The very first experience she had with this room was nothing happens in here. Right. But I think a lot of people are working in parts of their house where things have happened with the dog. They're working at the kitchen table, or they're, working in their bedroom, or who knows where. So the first time is the best time to just not respond, I think. So, but where people are getting into trouble is the dog comes in and they're in the middle of something and they need to do something right now to make the dog stop barking at them.
Yeah.
Because they haven't gotten the dog, they didn't manage to get the dog the walk. I mean, that stuff is hard. It's hard to like plan that in addition to like people are homeschooling their children and God knows what else. So the dog comes in and barks, and the person goes, "Oh, my trainer told me I'm supposed to feed them on the mat."
Yeah.
Right. And I've been as guilty of this as anybody else, of not doing it until the dog reminds me.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Right? Oh, forgot to put the mat out. Okay, here's the mat. And now I'm going to feed you while I'm on the phone. But I'm on the phone too. So I'm not paying a lot of attention to like what my criteria is for reinforcement. I'm basically just dropping food at a high rate. And what happens to a lot of people is they start to slow down because they get distracted by their work or something. And the dog is like,
excuse me. Yeah.
Excuse me. You've slowed down. So when we get to that point, then what do we do? And that's sort of like, there's a procedure that I'm kind of testing out, as part of my thesis to work on that. And it's unfortunate when you get to that point, because I think there's going to be some extinction involved in that, right? Even if you're reinforcing something else, which the problem of being on Zoom is that you can't really consistently reinforce something else, So that is a hard situation to get out of. So I would encourage people to be proactive and think about like one of the things that they talked about in grad school is if you're studying for a test, especially with online students, if you're studying for a test, like study for the test in the same place that you're going to take the test, right? Like put your damn bra on, like sit up in a chair. Like they did not say that in school, but I kind of extrapolated to that, like, if I'm going to be taking the test here at my desk, sitting up in a chair, maybe I shouldn't be studying like laying in bed with the covers on and my pajamas.
Yeah.
So I think that applies for dogs too. Like if you can teach them that certain areas of your house are for, I often do this with puppies. Like people want to know, I've got my puppy in the kitchen and the dining room, like, and there's a gate, like I don't have them in the living room, which is carpeted or has like a fancy piano with wooden legs that I can't put away or whatever.
Yeah.
And so then the question always comes up, like, well, how do I start to introduce them to the rest of the house? And what the dog is usually learning is like most of the activity that involves interacting with the owner is happening in this room, the kitchen. Like everybody trains their dog in the kitchen, right? Because that's where the food is. So be thoughtful about how are you going to introduce them into the living room? Like what behaviors are you going to reinforce in that context? Because that context is going to start to tell the dog to do those behaviors. So I think that's a way that people can avoid barking is, when we go in the living room, you're exercised, you're sleepy already. We do some mat training or whatever. Just we just relax together here and do petting. you know, and we don't reinforce behaviors in that room that we don't want in that room.
Yeah. And I appreciate that, how that relates to, coming into, I'm just sitting here in my office, right? I'm just thinking about, I mean, Sully doesn't do this, but I'm just, for the next dog, right? Where I'm sitting in my office, do I make this room valuable, right? Is this the room that you come into and request for additional reinforcement? And then I'm giving you access to reinforcement here. And then I actually don't give you access to reinforcement as much or in the other parts of the house, then like I might want to be able to, I'm just thinking about clients that like run into this issue where, yes, teaching them to be proactive is appropriate, teaching them like, what is the damage control plan, right? When you're on that Zoom call, we're just going to feed, right? But how can we make other rooms in the house be predictive for reinforcement, and you can ask me for what you might need in a way that works for both of us and actually get access to it, just not in this particular room. Like I love the idea of, changing the value of other rooms, and looking for the particular behaviors that you're wanting in those rooms, and how can we set up conditions, or how can we train for those behaviors in that space. I love that.
Yeah, humans learn that stuff all the time. Like we were talking about sneezing, like you don't sneeze like that in a movie theater. You don't, you don't yell fire in a movie theater. You don't, we learn it with clothes too. And lots of us do this with dogs too. Like this harness is for nose work and you can pull as much as you want. Yep. And this harness is for walking, in the woods, and this rig, this equipment is for walking on the sidewalk.
Yep.
And we do that too. Like if I put on a suit, like I'm probably less likely to say the F word, like a lot. So
notice she said less likely, everyone.
Yes.
She didn't say it was eliminated.
I didn't say it was realistic to eliminate that.
Good goals. Realistic goals.
Yes. That behavior has a lot of reinforcement history in a lot of different contexts. So it's going to be tough.
It's going to be tough.
Like thinking about parts of you, especially when your house has to serve as your office and your restaurant and your, your social venue. Your school. Yeah. It may be helpful, especially with a new dog who doesn't have prior experience in any of those areas of your house, to sort of put some thought into, what do I want this context to tell my dog to do, so that I don't have to tell what to do.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I'm thinking about my next dog and thinking about this in that context, and telling Sully to put his earmuffs on, but because my next dog. But anyway, right. But there's something so reinforcing having my lovely dog at my feet right now. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like, do I just not have them in the office altogether? But getting a puppy versus my senior dog, very, very different, right? When you're doing a ton of stuff online. So that's really interesting about thinking about which rooms predict which behaviors, and what you can do from the get-go, right? Like proactively, and then how you can, if you still have this, like if you didn't do all these things right from the start, and like most people haven't done, what we're saying is to be proactive about it, right? To make sure that the dog's needs are met and give them something else to do away. And then also to really build value and behavior sequences in other spaces within your house, right?
Yeah, so that there is context. I think it was building, like making the context the cue. Right. Mm-hmm. So how do cues get attached to behavior? They become, context or antecedents become significant when they predict reinforcement for a certain thing. Mm-hmm. So a certain room can predict reinforcement for laying around. It can predict certain types of reinforcement, like, we get lots of petting and rubs in this room for doing relaxed behaviors. Mm-hmm. It was really interesting when I was finding the subjects for my thesis research. The I had put the call out for dogs who barked at their owners while they were on Zoom. But one of the was really interesting. And one of the first things we did was just take a baseline, like let's set up, you're sitting on Zoom, like, no, you don't have any food in the environment or anything like that. And just try and talk to me on Zoom for 5 minutes and let's see what happens, sort of informal.
Yeah.
And one of the dogs came in the room and just laid down. And the owner was like, what the hell?
Yeah.
And it turned out it was because she didn't have her normal bowl of food on the desk. Like she had been preparing to reinforce her dog for good behavior during
she made it a thing.
Zoom calls. Yeah, she made it a thing. So we ended up, I ended up working with her as part of the experiment, but we changed it wasn't barking while the owner's on Zoom. Zoom was irrelevant. It was barking when the owner has food.
Yeah.
So
I love that example, Kiki.
Right.
Thank you.
And some of that, and a lot of that barking, like, and the other thing that's different about doing an experiment from how I should do more of this in my training, but I did an actual, experimental assessment. Like if we have a control condition and a test condition, like, if the owner does what they normally do, like what happens if the dog gets fed just on a time, every 3 seconds? Do we see barking? And we saw, no barking. And then what happens if we only feed the dog when he barks? And barking increased over time in that assessment. And we simplified it a little bit to just feeding the dog, but actually what she was tending to do is ask the dog for behavior that would then get food. Right. And that's what a lot of us do.
Yeah.
A lot of us have been told, if your dog is doing something you don't like, have them do something that you like better and then reward that. The order is off there. Right. If you're waiting until the dog is barking, let's bring it back to barking, because that's what we're supposed to be talking about. If you're waiting until the dog is barking and then you ask them to do something that you will reinforce, you're going to probably reinforce the barking. So ideally, and this is where most of us, I think, try to do when we're out working on reactivity and things like that, is you get ahead of the trigger. You get ahead of the thing that tells the dog that barking will be reinforced, and you reward something else before the barking happens. And then that kind of turns into like a cue transfer process. Like here's the cue that used to mean barking. We want that to be a cue to look at the owner or do something else, or just look at the dog without barking. Stand there. Stand there is great. So the dog sees the other dog and we feed the dog for barking. Or if you're doing, other, maybe you leave before the dog barks, but you give the dog a reinforcer for doing something other than barking before the barking starts, and that's not going to increase barking. But if you wait till the dog is barking and then you do your thing, you're going to reinforce barking. And that's that's actually what happens in the thank you protocol, which I know that you wanted to talk about, is we're actually doing that on purpose, because that protocol is usually something that I would use if the dog is barking at something that I can't get ahead of. Like basically they're barking at stuff that goes by the window, or they're barking at stuff that, sound outside the apartment door that I can't predict or get ahead of. Then I am going to go ahead and reinforce it, but there's more to it than that. So I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I think that's a great point to switch gears for this. And yeah, so go ahead and just tell our listeners a little bit about the protocol, like what it looks like. And it sounds like you've already talked about the specific cases that you're talking about, right? It is the situation where you can't get ahead of it. You're doing something in your home, cooking dinner, and the dog alerts to you that something is outside, whether it's a noise, something visual, right? Like they are alerting to something. And those are the situations that you would use this for, correct?
Yeah, sort of like, and I think we even have to talk about like alert, like I think when you actually talk to a lot of clients, if the dog is really just doing what I would think of as alerting, we kind of have to define that. Like if the dog is just woofing once,
it's like,
I don't care.
Let's actually
like,
not,
so
let's not
is
make
that
it
up
a thing.
to them?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's why people get dogs. And a lot of times when you talk to clients in more depth, they don't mind that kind of thing. They're like, I kind of like it when he lets me know there's somebody out on the porch. I just like him to not keep going.
Yeah.
Until they leave. And so if we want to change the bark, 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 bark until it goes away to something like bark once and then look at me like, hey, there's somebody outside. This protocol you can use this protocol sort of incompletely part way to accomplish that. You can teach your dog to bark once or twice. And then you can reinforce that.
Yep.
So that is one. So I think that's one thing to do before you start any kind of protocol is like find out like what actually is acceptable to the owner and what do they need. Maybe that they really do need almost no barking because they live in an apartment or with a neighbor who's threatening to evict them or something like that. I don't know, but a lot of times we don't need to eliminate barking. We just need to kind of be able to go, okay, got it. That's plenty of barking. So and I always feel weird calling it this because I see it referred to a lot as the thank you protocol, or worse, Kiki Yablon's thank you protocol. And I find that sort of embarrassing and inaccurate because lots of people do something like this. I didn't invent it. I'm just using principles that are already there. So let me just put that out there.
Oh my God, that's such a thing that we do in our profession, right? Is that like give it a name and a label and like attach all these things to it. I mean, we do that in general in life, period. But I just I have totally referred to it as your protocol.
It's okay. It's okay. I mean, so on the other hand, I have like 3 articles about it or something.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that's why everyone loves those articles, and we will link to those in the show notes.
Yeah. So so how it works is your dog is barking at something that you can't predict is going to happen, like sound outside. And it might be that your dog is doing that because it wants that sound to stop, or because what happens when he does that is the sound outside stops or the person goes out of sight or whatever. I think sort of going back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the podcast, I think sometimes a little bit of that bark is a startle response.
Yeah.
Which is, startling is considered a reflex. But again, like the sneeze, I think then as soon as you start barking, then it acquires usefulness. So what may start out as a like the dog equivalent of a like like turns into like get away. So what I think the easiest way to talk about this is to talk about how I did it the first time with my own dog, with Pigeon. So Pigeon barked and lunged at all kinds of things on walks outside of our house, people, other dogs, bicycles, skateboards, children, trucks, like all kinds of stuff. And out there, what we would do is work on it, by getting, seeing that and doing something before she started to respond to it. In our yard, we have 6-foot wooden privacy fence all around the yard, except for at the end of the gangway where there's like a chain link fence out that you can see the front sidewalk. And she would if anybody passed by that little narrow space, as soon as she saw them, she would run down the gangway to the gate and sort of hurl herself against the gate, snarling and barking. And my recall cue did not work. Like I could not call her back from that,
she's committed
from back in our yard.
Yeah.
And so I got the idea to try this technique from in the Karen Pryor Academy. There is an old video of Karen Pryor teaching in a hotel ballroom, and she's sort of talking about how cues work as reinforcers. And if you have a sequence of cues that are held together by reinforcers and you pull one of those cues out, certain predictable things happen to the behaviors around it, right? The behavior before it tends to weaken because the cue is the condition reinforcer for the previous behavior, right? And then of course, if you don't give the cue for the next behavior, that so it all kind of
it's a little messy.
The sequence kind of collapses on itself. That's not her words, that's mine. It kind of folds in on itself is what I always think of. So what I decided to do is I was going to try to actually set up a sequence on purpose where she barked and I reinforced it with a cue to come to me and get treats. And that's sort of the first step. And the goal there is, could I reinforce maybe less barking, right? Instead of barking constantly and snarling and hurling herself at the fence until this thing goes away, maybe we could just get that initial bark or two and then be expecting me to call her for food. So the way that I did that at that time was I just committed to taking food with me into the yard if we were out there together. So she was not out there unsupervised, and I always had treats. And as soon as she went to the fence, I would follow her and basically stand right up her butt and call her from right behind her. And my recall cue was a whistle. So I would stand right behind her and I'd whistle. And if I got so much as a dirty side eye, I would feed her. So I did that until basically it became a lot easier to get her attention. As soon as I started to follow her down the gangway, she was kind of like, oh, hey, do you have chicken? And so when I could whistle and she would whip her head around like, yes, chicken, then I started to not follow her as closely and call her from halfway down the gangway and then back further. And so I got to the point where I could call her, I could whistle from without following her down the sidewalk. And then I wanted to try the thing that Karen Pryor described in the video, and not call her. Basically, she had started to. So what I noticed the first time I did it is she ran down the gangway and she did however much barking she usually did before I got a chance to call her. And she turned around and looked at me are
we doing the thing?
Did it? You're not calling me? And then as soon as she turned to me, then I called her. And so I moved the reinforcer from the barking to the bark and turn.
Bark and turn. Yep.
And what happened when I started to do that is that the running down the gangway sort of got weaker. It got kind of perfunctory. She would run halfway down the gangway and then kind of turn and look at me and I would be ready to catch that. And the barking got almost eliminated. If something really big came up on the sidewalk, she would still run down there, but I could still call her back more easily. Most of the time she would actually sort of take one or two steps towards it and then look at me
and look at you.
And so I just kept reinforcing that. So now, to refine that for people so they don't have to kind of go through all the trial and error that you go through, right? You come up with better ideas okay, so first thing we need to do is when you're not working on this, we don't have access to the windows, you're using window film, you're gating off that room or whatever, you close the blinds or whatever. So they're not practicing it. And sometimes you're calling them and sometimes you're not. Second is you're going to do a really good job of teaching some kind of cue. So I just used my recall. What I've done with clients is usually just start with a totally new word. Don't screw with the recall. a lot of times the recall is not actually very good.
Yeah.
Let's just teach a word. And I chose thank you because it's just sort of gimmicky, honestly, like, because you can't say it mad, or it's harder to say. It's harder to say in a pissy tone.
You know what's funny about, no, I totally agree with you.
Yeah.
You know what's funny about that is as I started to incorporate this protocol into my practice, I am noticing that I say thank you to dogs often, just generally, like that's part of my like, thank you for that choice, or like it's part of my like praise or whatnot. And so I'm noticing that it's actually, I think I need I can't call the protocol thank you because I wind up saying it.
Yeah.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Like I'm poisoning the cue in some capacity. So I need to come up with a nicer one.
One of the things,
like that's enough still sounds like that's enough sounds rough. Like I have to come up with another fun one, but
I think that again, like other people do this too, but like I mentioned this on Hannah Brannigan's podcast. There was like a little round table with Smart Bitch, the ladies of Smart Bitch dog training, and we were talking about something related to this. And what I've had some clients do instead of even saying anything is just going to a location where treats are kept and getting the treats out and putting them like down on a mat that's right under that location or something, because you're not saying anything, but the dog learns like, oh, when you go over there,
this is
And then one thing that found useful is I'm holding up an OXO pop top container. Like this container makes basically a clicking sound. And that can be your cue.
That can be the cue. Yep.
Yeah. That can be the thing that you do when your dog starts to bark. You go press this button that makes a click. I mean, Irit Bloom actually had a great video. I think it's probably still on YouTube, where she actually does just click the dog for barking at the door.
Oh yeah. I've seen that video. Yeah. That's a good video. We can link to that.
Yeah. So there's nothing magical about the word thank you. I just like it because
like it. Yeah.
Language that kind of reframes the picture for the human.
I really like it.
Encourages them to be more, empathetic towards the dog. But I didn't use thank you with my dog. I used whistling, which now I can't do with a mask on. So that's a great recall. So have people teach that skill out of context first, right? Don't just start trying to do it when your dog is already barking at the window. Teach it out of context, and then teach it near the window. Like put your dog near the window when there's nothing out there and call them from short distances, and then call them from longer distances. Again, none of which I did with my dog, but she did have like a pretty strong recall cue in most other situations at the time. So, but a lot of people are going to need to build it up. So teach that cue until your dog is basically delighted to hear those words and starts running towards you when you say them. And then, introduce training sessions where there's something outside. And I think for most people, like it's not super practical to like try to set up somebody to be out there unless maybe it's me. But really you could just, decide for an hour, I'm going to open the blinds or take the window film off. And if something comes by, we're going to
organically practice. Yeah.
So I think the part that maybe I don't see as often is the strategic, like pulling that reinforcer out of the sequence, like pulling that recall cue out and then giving it
just waiting,
contingent on something that's closer down the line to coming to you instead of going to the window and barking. So I think of it as sort of taking that, like you've added a new reason for the dog to bark, maybe. Like I was barking to make the mailman go away. Now I'm barking to get you to call me for food. And then if the dog is barking for something that we can control, like the recall cue and the food, then we can use that to shape. So we can reinforce small steps in that are closer to our goal behavior. If our goal behavior is just, there's something outside, look at me.
Yep.
You know, there's something there, look at me is easy to do when you're out on a walk, because you can see the guy coming around the corner.
Yep.
But in your house you can't. So it's kind of a roundabout way of getting
to that same exercise. Yeah. Which, I mean, I appreciate, and I agree with you that you're seeing less of this, like, let's call this like phase 2, right? Where you are shaping and you're trying to you see something and you're checking back in with me. Because you're right. Like since I have implemented this with a few of my clients, like my one client's like, oh my gosh, like they're just so excited that the simple words of thank you, the dog is like, running back into the house, is not barking after the squirrels or whatnot. Like they're just so excited that they have something that they can do about the situation to get another behavior. And so, like this particular client, I'm excited to start working with them again in the new year, because I do want to ask them to sort of delay it a little bit. This is a dog that barks often, right? And so if we could reduce it even more and get to the point where you got with Pigeon, I think that would be really lovely for everyone involved. So yeah, I appreciate that some of our clients are just like, okay, great. I've got my foot in the door and I'm a part of the equation now. And that's all I really needed. Whereas like some might actually really want to take it to the next level and just get less and less and less barking.
Yeah, I think it has the potential to create an annoying situation.
Yeah.
Where your dog barks more at stuff out the window because of the result.
Yeah.
Or I've seen another pitfall might be that your dog barks and there's nothing out the window, and you think they're barking at something out the window. And so then you just teach your dog to sort of bark when they want to. And so I think there are some things to be careful about there. So
yeah. Awesome.
It's why you never want to sort of blindly follow a recipe.
Yes.
Right. You got to know how it works. You got to understand that what you're doing by redirecting the dog is reinforcing less barking.
Yep. And speaking of your protocol, or the thank you for barking protocol, you have done a really, really good job. The most recent blog post that was super helpful for me to sort of walk through. So we will post to all those links in our show notes. This way folks can actually see it written down if you learn better. That way you can check it out on Kiki's blog. So speaking of where people can find you online, we'll link to all of that in the show notes as well. But what's your website?
It's Kiki Yablon Dog Training.
Awesome.
.com. And then if you search for that business name on Facebook, I have a Facebook business page, and then I'm probably more active on Instagram these days, and it's Kiki.Yablon.
Awesome.
There.
We'll link to all of that.
Well, I'm not very active on it this week.
Yeah, it's the holidays this week, so it's fine.
I see lots of pictures of my senior dog sleeping.
Well, thank you so much. This is such an important topic. People talk about it all the time. And so thank you for talking about so many different types of barking today, and your amazing protocol, and just different strategies and things to consider when trying to modify this behavior. So thank you for being here.
Yeah. I should say also, I just realized that I sort of talked about the procedure I'm investigating for my thesis project. And I want to clarify that the goal of that experiment is to see if, because I mentioned that some extinction is probably going to end up being necessary once you have this really strong persistent behavior built up, and that the procedure is that I'm trying to explore is like, how could I reduce the amount of extinction that's needed and make it easier for the dog to catch on to that the rules are different now about what happens here. And I won't go into that procedure, but I did do a little mini presentation on it last year at Clicker Expo Live. It was part of Susan Friedman's presentation on function-based treatment. So if people want, like, I think a lot of people have access to all of the Clicker. Like if you went to Clicker Expo Live, I think that you had access for a year to all of the videos. So if people went to Clicker Expo and they didn't see that one, they can kind of find a description of what I did there. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing that.
Yep.
Well, thank you so much for being here again. And thank you for our listeners. And thanks so much, Kiki.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
It was really fun.